The first time I saw Dmitri, he was sitting in the corner of the childcare center, his small frame curled inward, hands folded tightly in his lap as if bracing himself against the world. His dark, watchful eyes met mine, not with curiosity, but with quiet hesitation. There were other children, laughing, playing, their voices a blur in the background, but he remained still, separate, as though he did not quite belong. Something inside me tightened. It was not sympathy. It was something deeper, something that whispered to me of fate, of certainty. This child, this solemn, delicate boy, was meant to be mine. I could feel the disapproving gazes of the staff, their unspoken judgments lingering in the air. A single woman, choosing to raise a child on her own? Did I know what I was asking for? Did I understand how much love, how much patience it would take? But love was not measured in expectations or approval. It was a quiet thing, a force that pulled without logic, without permission. I brought him home to my small apartment, where the scent of chamomile tea and vanilla always lingered, where the windows let in golden afternoon light that stretched in soft patterns across the worn wooden floor. He sat at the kitchen table, feet barely reaching the floor, his fingers resting lightly against the table's edge as if uncertain whether he was allowed to touch it. He was so quiet in those first days, his words locked away behind careful glances and slow, measured movements. I didn't press him. Instead, I let him watch as I moved through the space that was now his home. I made breakfast each morning, the scent of scrambled eggs and toast filling the air, offering him comfort without words. I placed warm socks on his feet when he forgot to wear them, left picture books by the window where the sunlight pooled, hoping he would reach for them when he was ready. Some evenings, when the light outside turned soft and dim, I would take his small hand in mine and walk with him along the quiet streets. The rhythm of our steps, the hush of the city settling in for the night, became our unspoken language. Little by little, the distance between us shrank. He never let go first. The rain had come suddenly, washing over the streets in silver sheets, drumming against rooftops, turning the pavement into a mirror of shifting lights. I held Dimitri's small hand as we hurried through the downpour, his fingers cold in mine, his short legs struggling to keep pace. I could feel the slight tremble in his grip, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something unspoken. We found shelter in a small cafe, its golden glow spilling onto the wet pavement. The door chimed softly as we stepped inside, the warmth of the space enveloping us immediately. The scent of fresh coffee and baked bread mingled in the air, wrapping around us like an embrace. I helped Dimitri out of his damp jacket, shaking the water from my own sleeves before guiding him toward a booth tucked away near the window. He climbed onto the seat with quiet obedience, his dark eyes flickering toward the other patrons, watching but never speaking. His small frame looked even smaller beneath the weight of his oversized sweater, the damp curls at his forehead clinging stubbornly to his skin. I smiled at him as I reached across the table, brushing his hair back with my fingers. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just blinked at me, his expression unreadable. It was a small moment, one of hundreds we had shared in the past few months, but it felt different somehow, heavier with meaning. The waitress approached, setting 2 steaming mugs in front of us, hot chocolate for him, tea for me. Dimitri wrapped his hands around his cup, fingers barely peeking from the sleeves of his sweater. The warmth must have felt good against his cold skin. He stared into the cocoa, the tendrils of steam curling upward, before finally taking a slow sip. I watched him in silence, the way his lashes flickered downward, the way his lips pressed together in quiet thought. He had always been like this, thoughtful, cautious, as if the world was something he had to observe carefully before deciding how much of himself he could give to it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, streaking the window with glistening rivulets. The cafe was filled with the hum of soft conversation, the clinking of spoons against porcelain, the occasional rustling of newspapers. It felt safe here, warm, like a cocoon separate from the storm raging outside. And then, without warning, he spoke. "Mommy!" It was barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in my chest, reverberating through my very bones. I froze. The world outside the window blurred into nothing, the murmur of the cafe faded, and all I could hear was the soft, fragile sound of his voice, the single word that carried more weight than any grand declaration ever could. I felt something inside me crack open, something I had been holding on to without realizing it. Tears stung my eyes, hot and unexpected, as I reached for him with trembling hands. I cupped his face gently, my thumbs tracing the delicate curve of his cheekbones. His skin was warm beneath my touch, his breath steady, and for the first time, he didn't just allow my affection, he leaned into it. My fingers slid through his damp curls as I exhaled, a shaky, disbelieving breath. "Say it again," I wanted to whisper. "Just once more." But I didn't. I only nodded, blinking away my tears, letting my hands speak where words failed me. He had chosen me. Outside, the rain softened into a gentle mist, the harsh drumming on the windows giving way to a quiet rhythm, as if the storm itself had settled, recognizing the moment for what it was. That night, as we walked home beneath the softened hush of the rain, he reached for my hand again. Not out of necessity, not because I was leading him forward, but because he wanted to. His small fingers threaded through mine with a certainty that had not been there before. And in that moment, I knew this was the beginning of something unbreakable. The years passed like pages turning in a book, some moments lingering, others slipping by unnoticed. Dmitri was no longer a quiet, uncertain boy, but a young man who carried himself with quiet confidence, his once small hands now strong and sure. Yet, despite the changes, there were things that remained the same. The way he still reached for a cup of tea in the evenings, the way he still stopped to watch the autumn leaves dance in the wind, the way his eyes still softened when he looked at me, even as his world grew larger. And it was growing. It began in the smallest ways, new acquaintances, longer conversations, weekends spent outside our small apartment, the sound of his laughter drifting back through the door as he returned home. I watched him with a quiet kind of pride, knowing this was how it should be. He was stepping into the world on his own, stretching beyond the life we had built together. Then one day he mentioned a name. Lisa. He spoke of her casually at first, in passing, like a detail he wasn't sure mattered. But I noticed the way he said it, the way his voice softened just slightly, the way his lips curved into the smallest smile. And then, suddenly, she was everywhere in his stories, her kindness, her laughter, the way she understood him in ways that others rarely did. I knew, long before he told me, that she was important. The first time I met her, it was a crisp autumn afternoon, the air tinged with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Dmitri had invited her over for tea, and I had spent the morning preparing, my hands moving over the porcelain cups, my heart thrumming with something I couldn't quite name. I had never felt this before, not jealousy, no, but something close to loss, something that whispered of change in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. And then she arrived. Lisa was warm and open, her smile easy, her presence light. She had the kind of energy that filled a room without overwhelming it. When she spoke to Dmitri, he listened, not just with patience, but with care, the way one does when someone truly matters. And when she turned to me, she met my eyes without hesitation, as if she understood how much I loved him, understood what it meant to stand in this space between past and future. "You have a beautiful home," she said, her voice genuine. I smiled, nodding as I poured the tea. "Thank you," I murmured, my hands steady even as my heart wavered. She watched Dmitri as he spoke, the way he gestured lightly with his hands, the way his voice carried the same warmth I had always known. And in that moment I knew. She loved him. It was in the way she looked at him, the way she leaned in just slightly when he spoke, the way she seemed to understand his silences. And more than that, he loved her, too. That evening, after she had left, I stood by the kitchen sink, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the porcelain. The house felt quieter somehow, even though nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Dmitri stepped into the room, his gaze searching mine, as if he knew what I was thinking. "She makes you happy," I said simply. He hesitated, then nodded. "She does." I exhaled slowly, nodding, turning to face him fully. He was taller than me now, broader, his presence filling the space in a way it hadn't before. I reached up, brushing my fingers lightly against his cheek, the way I had when he was a boy. He didn't pull away. "She's wonderful," I said softly. "I'm happy for you." And I was, even if, deep down, I felt something shifting, something slipping through my fingers like sand. The world we had built, our world, was changing, and I had to learn how to let it, The invitation came on a quiet afternoon, sunlight spilling through the windows, filling the kitchen with golden warmth. Dmitri leaned against the counter, hands tucked into his pockets, that small, thoughtful crease between his brows, the one I had memorized long ago. "Lisa and I want you to join us for dinner," he said. "Just something simple. There's a little restaurant nearby that she really likes." His voice was casual, but I knew him too well. He was watching me, measuring my reaction, waiting to see if I would hesitate. And I did. Not because I didn't want to go, but because something inside me whispered that this was another step forward, another moment where the past and future blurred, where our world, the one we had built with quiet rituals and unspoken understanding, was shifting. I smiled, hiding the way my heart clenched. "I'd love to," I said. That evening, I took my time getting ready, smoothing down my dress, adjusting my hair, checking the apartment one last time before stepping out. I wasn't sure why, perhaps an old habit, the instinct to create warmth, to make sure everything felt just right. The restaurant was small and intimate, tucked away on a quiet street where the glow of lanterns flickered in the autumn breeze. The scent of roasted herbs and warm bread filled the air as I stepped inside, my coat wrapped tightly around me. And then I saw them. Dmitri and Lisa sat near the window, the candlelight casting soft shadows across their faces. He was leaning slightly toward her, listening intently as she spoke, his expression gentle, his eyes warm. And she was watching him the way I used to, with quiet admiration, as if he were something fragile and precious, something to be cherished. I hesitated for just a moment, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. This was new. Not the love. I had always known that love would find him, that he would grow, that he would build something outside of me. But seeing it so clearly, seeing the way his world had expanded beyond the two of us, was something else entirely. And yet, when he looked up and saw me, his face brightened in a way that made my heart settle. He stood, moving toward me without hesitation, wrapping his arms around me in a way that was neither rushed nor obligatory. Just his, just ours. I melted into his embrace, resting my cheek against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of home. "You came," he murmured. "Of course I did." He pulled back slightly, his hands resting lightly on my arms, as if grounding me in the moment. There was no sadness in his gaze, only warmth, only certainty. Lisa smiled as I sat down, her presence easy, natural, as though she had always been meant to be part of this picture. Dinner was filled with laughter and soft conversation, the kind that made time slip by unnoticed. Dmitri reached for Lisa's hand more than once, their fingers brushing, their glances holding quiet meaning. And each time, I felt that same ache, soft, bittersweet, but not painful. This was love, after all. And love, I reminded myself, was meant to grow. Later that night, as I returned home, the apartment felt different. Not empty, never empty, but quieter. I set my purse down, ran my hand along the worn edge of the kitchen table, my fingers lingering on the places where time had left its mark. And then from down the hall I heard it, the quiet sound of Dmitri's laughter, followed by the gentle murmur of voices. He was still here, still mine. I leaned against the doorway of his room, watching as he sat on the floor, his phone in his hand, talking softly to Lisa. He glanced up and saw me, a question flickering in his eyes. I smiled, shaking my head. Just wanted to say good night. He set his phone down for a moment, moving toward me with that same easy grace, wrapping his arms around me in a way that felt both new and familiar. I closed my eyes, sinking into the warmth of him, letting myself believe, just for a moment, that time had not changed us. And maybe, in the ways that mattered most, it hadn't. The house had never felt so still. I sat by the window, cradling a cup of tea between my hands, watching the city beyond the glass. Streetlights flickered in the early dusk, casting long, golden reflections onto the pavement. A couple passed below, their laughter carried by the autumn breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a child's voice rang out, a reminder of a world that kept moving, changing, unfolding, even as I sat there, suspended in a moment I wasn't quite ready to name. Dmitri was out with Lisa again. It had been happening more often now, long evenings spent elsewhere, phone calls exchanged in hushed tones, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her unmistakable. I was happy for him. I was. But happiness, I realized, could exist alongside longing. I ran my fingers along the rim of my cup, tracing idle circles, letting the warmth seep into my skin. It was an old habit, one Dmitri had picked up from me when he was younger. I used to watch him do the same, his small hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, his brows furrowed in quiet concentration. He had always been a child of few words, speaking more through gestures, through the way he lingered near me when he was uncertain, the way his hand would slip into mine without thought. Even as he grew, even as he found his own place in the world, I had always felt the invisible thread that tethered us together. But now that thread was stretching. Not breaking, no, just shifting. I thought of Lisa, her bright, easy presence, the way Dmitri looked at her as if she had become part of the air he breathed. It was a beautiful thing to witness, but it carried a quiet ache, too. The kind that settled in the spaces between memories, in the realization that the world we had built together was no longer just ours. A sound pulled me from my thoughts, the soft creak of the front door opening. I turned, my heart giving a small, familiar leap. Dmitri. His hair was slightly tousled from the wind, his coat dusted with the faint scent of the cool night air. He set his keys down on the table and met my gaze, hesitating for a moment. Then, without a word, he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't hurried, wasn't obligatory. It was his. It was ours. I exhaled slowly, resting my cheek against his shoulder, closing my eyes as the warmth of him settled over me. He was taller now, broader, his embrace strong and steady. But to me, he was still the little boy who had once clung to my hand on rainy evenings, the child who had whispered "Mommy" for the first time in a quiet cafe, his voice fragile and full of trust. "I missed you today," I murmured. He tightened his arms around me, just slightly. "I'm still here," he said, his voice soft. "I'll always be here." I smiled against his shoulder, a quiet relief washing through me. Maybe love didn't shrink when it was shared. Maybe it only grew. And maybe, just maybe, there was no reason to be afraid.